I was wiping the table when I heard my grandson's voice carry from the hallway. His words were low, almost casual, but they dropped into the room like a stone. "You won't be around long anyway." The rag slipped from my hand, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the sound in my ears was the house settling or my own pulse picking up. I didn't move. I just stood there, letting the sentence sit in the air while something cold tightened across my chest. A boy shouldn't speak that way to anyone, let alone the man who raised him for half his childhood. I took a quiet step toward the doorway, half thinking I must have heard wrong. My hearing isn't perfect at 72, and sometimes voices blur, but the tone had been clear, flat, dismissive, like my existence was something temporary he didn't need to respect. I eased my head around the frame. He wasn't looking my way. He was staring at the wall, shoulders stiff, jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen on him before. He didn't look angry. He looked empty, like someone had pulled the warmth right out of him. I didn't speak. I wanted to ask who he was talking to, or if the words were meant as some kind of joke, but the sight of him kept me still. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and his foot tapped the floor like he was waiting for someone's approval. I watched him shift his weight as if he wished he were someplace else. My own breath came slow, the kind you take when you're trying not to set off a trap. Something about the room felt wrong, too quiet, too tense. Then a shadow stretched across the hallway floor, long and sharp against the light. Someone was standing behind him. My grandson didn't turn. He kept his gaze down, shoulders rounded, like a boy who'd already been caught doing something he didn't want to explain. When the shadow moved, I straightened a little, unsure if I should make my presence known. The figure stepped forward, and the school principal came into view. Her expression changed the moment she saw me watching. Her eyes widened just enough to reveal she had heard every word he'd spoken. She tried to school her face back into something polite, but the shift was too late. I saw the flicker of recognition, the quick calculation behind her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together, as if something had gone wrong in whatever she expected to happen here. I cleared my throat softly, not to startle them, but to make it clear I wasn't eavesdropping by choice. My grandson jerked a little, like he'd only just realized someone else existed in the house. He didn't meet my eyes. He looked past me, around me, anywhere but at me. A strange tightness ran through his posture, as if the presence behind him weighed more than it should. The principal offered a short nod, the kind adults give when they want to seem composed but can't hide their discomfort. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice too careful, too measured. She stood close to my grandson, closer than a school official needed to. Her hand rested near his shoulder, but not on it, the way someone might hover when they want control without showing it. I didn't understand why she was here. She hadn't called. She hadn't sent a message. She had shown up unannounced, standing in my hallway like she belonged there. That unsettled me more than the sentence I'd overheard. School staff visited for meetings, emergencies, official matters. You didn't appear in a child's home without a clear reason. My grandson finally glanced my way, but his eyes slid off mine as fast as they touched. Something in that moment pricked at me, a quiet warning I couldn't explain. He wasn't himself. He wasn't the boy who used to run through this house with loud footsteps and easy laughter. Something had shifted inside him, and the presence of the principal made that shift sharper, more defined. She gave a tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "We were just discussing some school concerns," she said, but her tone didn't match the casual words. There was too much tension in her shoulders, too much pressure in the space between them. I held her gaze for a breath longer than was comfortable, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The air around us felt heavy, like the room knew something I didn't yet. I said nothing. I couldn't. The moment was too strange, too pointed. Something in me recognized the first sting of danger, faint but unmistakable. Something here was wrong, and it had already begun moving long before I stepped into the doorway. The house felt too quiet after they left. I stood in the living room longer than I needed to, letting the silence settle in places where noise used to live. It's a strange thing, how a home can hold echoes of people who aren't here anymore. My wife used to fill these rooms with the soft rhythm of her voice, humming while she cooked or reading on the couch with a blanket over her legs. Losing her changed the weight of the air. Some days it felt light, like I could breathe again. Other days it felt thick enough to press against my ribs. Living alone at my age isn't tragic, but it does make you sensitive to small shifts, especially in the people you love. My grandson used to bring that warmth back without even trying. He'd sit beside me during meals, asking about my old woodworking tools or stories from when his mother was his age. He'd run up to show me drawings or new games he liked. But something started changing about 3 months ago. It wasn't sudden. It was the quiet kind of change, the sort that sneaks into a home before anyone knows to close the door. He grew distant, shorter with his words, like each sentence cost him something he didn't want to spend. I tried asking my daughter if she'd noticed anything, but she brushed it off as teen mood swings. She said his classes were harder this year, and he was feeling pressure. I wanted to believe her. It would have been easier if this was just a rough patch. But the look in his eyes had shifted into something I hadn't seen before, something guarded. The first true red flag showed itself one evening while he sat on the couch scrolling through his phone. I stepped into the room to ask what he wanted for dinner. He flinched the moment he saw me, then angled the screen away from my view so sharply the movement looked rehearsed. He muttered something about just school stuff, but his fingers trembled on the screen. I didn't push. The boy has a right to privacy. But the way he protected that phone wasn't the normal kind of teenage secrecy. It was fear, tight, instinctive, immediate. Around that same time, the principal began showing up at the house. The first visit seemed formal enough. She said she wanted to check on his academic support. The second visit came only a week later. The third arrived without warning, and she spoke like she already knew her way around our entryway. She always carried the same tone, soft concern layered over something firmer. Something that didn't fit with casual school involvement. My daughter thought it meant the school cared about him. She said the principal was just being thorough. But thorough didn't explain the timing or the frequency. It didn't explain why the woman's eyes lingered on my grandson like she was waiting for him to break. Each visit left the boy quieter than before, retreating to his room with his phone clutched in his hand like a shield. I watched him more closely after that. I started noticing the way his shoulders tightened whenever the doorbell rang. I saw the way he scanned the living room before he walked through it, as if checking for someone he didn't want to meet. When I spoke to him, he listened, but he didn't look at me fully. His nerves weren't pointed at me. They were aimed at something outside himself. The thing that settled uneasily in my mind wasn't anger or disappointment. It was concern. He wasn't pulling away from me because he wanted distance. He was pulling away because he was afraid, and I needed to understand why. That fear didn't grow from anything in this house. It came from somewhere else, someone else. And the more I replayed the principal's expression in the hallway, the more I felt a tug of dread I couldn't ignore. I didn't confront him. I didn't press him. Boys his age shut down when pushed. Instead, I began watching, carefully, quietly, without letting him see the shift in my posture or the questions forming in my head. I didn't know exactly what I'd find. But something had already moved into the space between us, and I wasn't going to stand by while it grew. A week later, I logged into the school portal to check his class schedule. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. His grades had always been steady, nothing fancy but consistent. This time the screen showed a shift. 2 subjects had dropped by a full letter grade. It wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't normal either. The numbers sat there in muted red, small but loud enough to raise the hair on my arms. I scrolled down, looking for comments or explanations, but the sections were empty. When he came into the kitchen later, I asked him how school was going. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Everything's fine." His voice was tight, clipped at the edges. The contradiction landed heavier than his words. Kids can hide emotions, but they don't hide school performance without a reason. I wanted to ask more, but something in his posture warned me to tread carefully. He wasn't avoiding responsibility. He was avoiding something else. Later that afternoon, my phone chimed with a notification. It was an email from the school. The principal wanted to schedule another private discussion regarding my grandson. The wording was strange, formal, yet vague. Private discussions weren't common, and this would make the 4th one in under 2 months. I read the message twice, letting the phrasing sink in. She hadn't asked if there were concerns on my end. She simply requested the meeting, as if the need was obvious. I was carrying the trash out to the bin that evening when a scrap of paper slid out of the bag and landed near my foot. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it was just another flyer or receipt. But when I smoothed the crumpled edges, I recognized the school logo at the top. It was a detention slip, one I had never been told about. The handwriting was firm, the ink still dark. My grandson's name sat near the top, followed by a brief note that made my stomach tighten. "Home conditions appear unstable. Further oversight required. Those were heavy words to leave on a slip of paper thrown into a kitchen trash can. I read the line again, slower this time. Unstable. Oversight. These aren't terms teachers use lightly, and certainly not without speaking to a guardian. I folded the slip once, then tucked it into my back pocket. There was no anger in me, just a steady, rising sense of something shifting out of place. When he returned from the living room, I asked him calmly if there was anything he wanted to tell me about school. He froze for a second, his face going still in a way I hadn't seen before. I handed him the slip without a word. His reaction wasn't guilt, it wasn't defiance. It was fear, raw and immediate. His eyes widened, and his breath caught as if he expected something far worse than a conversation. He shook his head quickly. I didn't mean to, she said. The words tangled in his mouth, and he pulled his gaze away like he was expecting someone else to overhear him. His hands trembled as he held the slip, and he looked at the doorway like the principal might appear there without warning. I told him he wasn't in trouble. My voice stayed even, steady enough to calm a normal child, but he wasn't calming. His shoulders rose and fell too, fast, and he pressed the slip to his chest like it was dangerous to let it be seen. He kept repeating, "It's nothing, it's nothing," but the tremor in his voice said otherwise. It was then, watching the fear climb up his spine, that I realized the truth I'd been circling around. He wasn't afraid of me. He wasn't worried about disappointing me or getting grounded or explaining a mistake. His fear belonged to someone else, someone who had authority over him in ways I didn't yet understand. The first lie had finally shown itself, small on the surface, but deep enough to shift everything underneath. And the boy I loved was caught in the middle of something he didn't know how to escape. I decided to walk into the school the next morning without calling ahead. I didn't have a plan, just a need to see the place for myself. The building looked the same as it always had. Clean hallways, bright posters on the walls, the usual chatter from students moving between classes. But the moment I stepped through the office door, a thin ripple of tension ran across the room. The receptionist glanced up, recognized me, and straightened a little too quickly. "I'd like to look over my grandson's academic records," I said. My voice was calm, steady enough not to raise alarm, but her expression tightened anyway. She asked for his name, and when I told her, she looked over her shoulder before typing anything. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, hesitating for a second that shouldn't have mattered, but did. While she clicked through screens, 2 teachers passed the doorway. They weren't loud, but their whisper carried just enough. "Did you see the report?" one murmured. The other gave a short nod, the kind that said the subject was unpleasant. They noticed me standing there and fell silent instantly. The second teacher gave me a quick, uneasy glance before they moved on. It wasn't the look people give a disruptive parent. It was something quieter, like they weren't sure how much I knew. The receptionist finally printed a small stack of papers and handed them over. The pages were thin, too few for a full academic record. I flipped through them while standing at the counter. Assignments missing, comments absent, no notes from recent months, holes everywhere. "This is everything?" I asked. She swallowed hard and nodded, but her eyes drifted toward a filing cabinet behind her as if something else should have been there. I thanked her and stepped aside, pretending to read through the papers again. What she'd given me didn't match what I'd seen on the portal. Grades missing, reports cut off, entire sections blank. I tucked the pages into my coat pocket and walked down the hallway, staying near the lockers so I wouldn't draw attention. Students rarely notice older men in school hallways. Adults, though, they notice too much. Near the end of the corridor, I spotted a teacher I recognized from a past open house. She was stacking papers outside her classroom. When she looked up and saw me, her expression softened in a way that wasn't friendly. It was careful. "You're here for him, aren't you?" she asked under her breath. "For his files," I replied, keeping my voice low. "They seem incomplete." Her eyes darted toward the office, then back to me. She stepped an inch closer. "You should check the principal's recent activities." Her tone wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight, the kind people use when they can't speak openly. Before I could ask anything, a student approached her for help, and she stepped back into her role, leaving the rest unsaid. I walked farther down the hall until I reached a bulletin board outside the administrative offices. A folder sat half open on a small table below it, like someone had set it there in a hurry. I wasn't trying to pry, but a familiar name on the top sheet caught my eye. My grandson's. I picked it up slowly, making sure no one was watching. The heading read, Disciplinary summary, though I'd never been informed of any summary before. I scanned the lines, feeling my jaw tighten as the words sank in. The report claimed ongoing behavior concerns, emotional instability, and unsafe home dynamics. None of it was true. The language was sharp, almost clinical, and all signed by the principal. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. I slid the paper back into the folder and placed it exactly where I found it. I didn't want to alert anyone by taking it, but the damage was done. The picture forming in my mind was becoming clearer. The missing records, the panicked look on my grandson's face, the principal's unannounced visits, they all fit into a pattern that wasn't accidental. As I walked out of the building, I felt the weight of everything shift. Someone had started building a story around us, a false one, and the pieces were lining up in someone else's favor. My grandson wasn't acting out. He was reacting. And whatever the principal was doing, it wasn't in his interest. For the first time, I understood that what I was stepping into wasn't a school issue. It was something deeper, and it had already begun tightening around the boy and me. The turning point came late in the evening, when the house had settled into its usual quiet, and my grandson was doing homework at the dining table. I sat down with my laptop to review the school portal again, hoping for some clarity. Instead, a new notification popped up in my inbox, an automated copy of an email from the school system. At first glance, it looked routine, but the subject line stopped me cold. Concerns regarding guardian fitness. I opened it slowly, the way you might open a door when you're not sure what's behind it. The email stated, in plain language, that I was unfit to care for a minor due to age-related limitations and unstable household environment. My name sat there like a warning label. Near the bottom, in bold letters, it said the message had been forwarded directly to Child Services. The sender was the principal. The room felt tighter as I read each sentence. This wasn't speculation or school gossip. This was formal documentation aimed at removing my grandson from my care. I kept reading, scanning for anything remotely true, but the claims were built from thin air. There were no incidents, no evaluations, no evidence. It was a manufactured case against me. I didn't want to panic him, but when my breath caught, my grandson looked up. His eyes flicked to the screen, and he went pale before I could angle the laptop away. He stood from his chair so suddenly, it scraped against the floor. "Did she send it?" he asked, voice cracking at the edges. I didn't answer. "Not yet." "What do you know about this?" I asked quietly. He clasped his hands together, like he needed something to hold on to. "She said if I didn't tell her you were having problems, she'd put me in a special program." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Say your grandpa's too old or else." That's what she told me. The words landed like blows. I leaned back, letting them settle into place, trying not to let the anger break the surface. He kept talking, the fear spilling out in pieces. The principal had pulled him aside during lunch, after class, even during dismissal. She told him she was monitoring welfare. She said she had authority to make changes if necessary. My grandson's face twisted, not in defiance, but in the raw confusion of a child trapped between two adults with unequal power. "I didn't want to say anything," he whispered. "I didn't want her to get mad. She kept saying she'd take me out of class and talk to people. She said you wouldn't understand." I breathed slowly, steadying myself. It wasn't his fault. This was an adult using power to shape fear. He sat back down, but his shoulders remained tight, like he was bracing for punishment that wasn't coming. The pressure he'd been carrying finally showed itself, heavy enough to bow the spine of any child. I turned the laptop toward me again and reread the email, this time with a different clarity. The principal hadn't been documenting academic issues. She'd been building a narrative, a false one, in quiet, calculated steps. Every visit, every whispered comment, every unexplained slip now fit into a single motive. This wasn't about school performance. This was targeted manipulation designed to separate us. My chest tightened, not with fear for myself, but with the thought of him sitting in that school under her authority. If she could fabricate reports and send official claims without oversight, there was no telling what else she might do. For the first time since this began, a sharp, physical anxiety surged through me. The idea of sending him back there in the morning felt dangerous. He watched me, carefully, waiting for some sign of what would happen next. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make promises, but I felt the ground shift beneath us. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a school issue that could be smoothed over. Someone had decided we were a problem to be handled. And now that I understood the shape of it, I knew I couldn't treat this as anything less than a direct threat. The next morning, I walked my grandson to school myself. I didn't let him see the worry sitting in my posture, but I stayed close enough to read every shift in his breathing. When we reached the entrance, I told him I needed to speak with someone in private and sent him inside with a calm nod. Once he disappeared into the crowd of students, I headed toward the counseling office. I wasn't sure who I'd find, but I knew avoiding the problem wasn't an option anymore. The counselor was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a voice softened by years of listening. When I introduced myself, something in her expression sharpened. She closed her office door behind us and asked me to sit. Her posture stayed polite, but her tone dropped into something cautious, almost protective. "I'm guessing this is about the principal," she said quietly. I didn't confirm it outright. I simply asked if she was aware of any concerns surrounding my grandson. She exhaled slowly, then opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, too thin for a full record. "She's been involved," the counselor said, "more than she should be, and not just with your family." That sentence settled into the room with heavy certainty. She flipped the folder open, and inside were attendance reports with edits visible in the margins, dates adjusted, notes added after the fact. "These should match what you see on the parent portal," she said, "but they don't." She showed me another sheet, a behavior log marked with warnings that never happened. The handwriting matched the disciplinary report I'd found earlier. "She's done this before," the counselor added. "2 families last year. One eventually pulled their child out of school. The other, well, they were investigated by child services for months." I kept my voice steady, but the edges of the room tightened around me. "Why?" "We don't know," she said. She uses phrases like student welfare and protective oversight, but the pattern is always the same. She identifies a family, creates documentation, and then pushes for removal. She paused. "Your grandson is her focus now, and she's escalating." The words didn't shock me as much as they confirmed what I already felt twisting beneath the surface. The counselor looked toward the door before speaking again. "You need to protect him. She's already submitted claims about your home. Once those systems start moving, they're hard to stop." She slid the altered reports toward me. "Take pictures. Don't take them. Originals. If I remove them from this office, I could lose my job. But you'll need proof." I photographed every page carefully, making sure the timestamps were visible. The counselor watched the hallway as I worked, tension written across her shoulders. When I finished, she gave a small nod, the kind people give when they've done everything they can, without crossing a line. "Get help," she said. "Official help. She won't stop on her own." I left the school with the images heavy in my phone and a clearer understanding of the threat pressing in on us. This wasn't personal frustration or a school official overstepping boundaries. It was deliberate construction, a narrative designed to separate a child from his guardian. The stakes weren't theoretical anymore. They were immediate. At home, I contacted a legal aid clinic. The attorney who called me back sounded young but sharp, the type who handled these cases often enough to recognize patterns. After hearing everything, he didn't hesitate. "This is systematic coercion," he said. "Not a misunderstanding. Document everything. Do not confront her directly. We'll need a timeline and all evidence." His words provided structure to the dread already forming inside me. Coercion, targeting, manipulation through official channels. The kind of behavior that destroys families if no one steps in soon enough. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of the living room and felt the line I'd been walking shift beneath my feet. There was no going back to hoping this would resolve itself. No pretending the situation was smaller than it was. The principal wasn't watching us. She was building a case. And now, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not for revenge, not out of anger, but because if I didn't expose her, she would take the boy I loved from the only safe place he had left. The attorney was clear. Gathering evidence quietly would be the only way to protect my grandson. No confrontations, no warnings, no tipping off the principal before the truth was fully in my hands. I wrote everything down the moment we hung up. Dates, times, comments, the altered documents. The more I listed, the more obvious the pattern became. But I forced myself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help him. Accuracy would. 2 days later, the principal called. The moment her name appeared on my phone, I felt a cold steadiness settle over me. I let it ring twice, then answered with the same polite tone I always used. She made her voice soft, almost sympathetic. as she said she wanted to schedule another private meeting regarding your grandson's concerning behavior. I held the phone an inch away so the recording app could capture her words clearly. She asked pointed questions, whether I'd noticed a decline in his environment, whether I felt overwhelmed, and whether I could trust myself to keep up with his needs. Each question was shaped like help, but carried the weight of accusation. I confirmed the meeting without emotion. She thanked me with exaggerated warmth and hung up. I saved the recording instantly. That evening, I sat with my grandson at the kitchen table. He kept glancing at the doorway, like he expected someone else to be listening. I spoke gently, making sure the space felt safe. I told him I'd learned the truth about the reports and that none of it was his fault. For the first time in weeks, he looked at me fully. His shoulders eased just enough for him to breathe normally. When I asked if he'd be willing to tell the truth to an attorney or official somewhere away from school, he nodded slowly. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and honest. Over the next few days, I contacted the two teachers who had seemed uneasy during my earlier visit. I didn't push them to give statements, but I explained that I was seeking clarity. One invited me after school hours and signed a brief note confirming the discrepancies in his records. Another wrote that she had witnessed the principal calling my grandson into her office repeatedly, without standard documentation. These weren't accusations. They were observations from people trying to help in the only way they safely could. By the middle of the week, the principal began leaving messages. The first one was clipped, asking why I hadn't responded to her emails. The second suggested she was concerned about my resistance. The third was quiet, almost whispered, warning that delaying cooperation would complicate outcomes. None of it was explicit, but the tone had changed. Her voice carried strain, like she felt something slipping out of her control. I played each voicemail once, saved them, and backed them up. They weren't threats, not directly, but they revealed the increasing instability behind her actions. It was hard not to feel a flicker of fear when I heard the quieter pauses between her words. But fear wasn't useful now. Precision was. By the end of the week, the folder on my desk had grown thick. Printed screenshots, timestamps, recordings, testimonies, and the altered documents the counselor had shown me. There was no satisfaction in seeing it all laid out, just a sense of grim readiness. I wasn't building a trap to harm someone. I was preparing a shield for a child who couldn't defend himself. The night before the scheduled meeting, I sat at the table with the folder open. I reviewed everything twice, not searching for mistakes, but making sure I could walk into that room with clarity. No accusations, no raised voice, just the truth, organized and undeniable. When morning came, I dressed calmly, ate quietly, and walked out the door without waking my grandson. He didn't need to see my nerves or my resolve. He needed to feel safe. At the school entrance, I paused for one steady breath. The hallway ahead felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights humming with a low, clinical buzz. I held the folder under my arm, the recordings in my pocket, and the counselor's whisper in the back of my mind. Then I stepped inside the building alone, ready for whatever came next. The principal's office door was already cracked open when I arrived, like she expected me to hesitate before stepping inside. I knocked once anyway. She looked up from her desk with a rehearsed smile that didn't come anywhere near her eyes. The blinds were drawn, and the lights were too dim for a school office, giving the room a closed-in feeling. She gestured toward the chair across from her. "I'm glad you came," she said. "We need to discuss your grandson's situation. Honestly, at your age, raising a teenager can be unrealistic." Her voice slid over the word like it was a gentle suggestion, but the message beneath it hit sharp. "You're too old to raise him." I sat down slowly, letting her finish her prepared speech. She talked about declining oversight, emotional burden, appropriate guardianship. Each phrase was shaped to sound official, but the tone carried unmistakable pressure. I didn't interrupt. I let her build her narrative until she paused long enough to check if it had sunk in. When she finally waited for my response, I reached into my coat and placed a small stack of printed pages on her desk. "I brought some documents," I said carefully. Her posture shifted in a flicker, chin lifting, eyes narrowing. "What documents?" I slid the first sheet forward, the altered attendance logs, then the falsified behavior notes, then the email she'd sent to child services. She didn't touch them. She stared at the headers as if the words themselves were dangerous. "I also brought recordings," I said. My voice stayed level, not raised, not threatening. Including our last phone call. Something snapped behind her expression, a crack she couldn't hide. You had no right to record me, she said, her voice dropping its false warmth. We have a duty to protect students. Your grandson requires special care. You're obstructing that. There it was, the truth she hadn't meant to say out loud. Not academics, not welfare, a special care program she kept trying to funnel him toward. A decision she'd already made long before I stepped into this office. I didn't answer her accusation. I didn't need to. She was unraveling on her own. The door opened behind me. I turned slightly, expecting an assistant, maybe another staff member. Instead, my grandson stood in the doorway, eyes wide but steady. Beside him was the school counselor, her face drawn tight with resolve. She placed a calming hand on his shoulder as they stepped inside. The principal shot to her feet. This is a private meeting, she snapped. No, the counselor said calmly. It isn't. Not anymore. The room thickened with silence. My grandson looked at me, then at the principal, and spoke in a voice that shook, but didn't break. You told me to say things about him that weren't true. The principal's breath hissed through her teeth. You misunderstood. He didn't, the counselor said. She moved forward, placing a note on the desk, her own written statement. I've seen the altered reports. I've witnessed you removing him from class without documentation. This pattern isn't new. The principal's hand shot toward the papers on her desk. Give me that, she said, reaching for the documents I'd brought. She didn't get far. 2 security officers stepped into the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. One of them moved between her and the desk, blocking her hand before she could grab anything. Ma'am, step back, the officer said firmly. She froze, breath sharp, eyes flashing with something between fury and panic. For the first time, the authority in the room wasn't hers. I stood, gathering the documents into a neat stack. My hands didn't shake. I expected they would, but they didn't. These are going to the district office, I said. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just stating a fact that could no longer be bent. The principal didn't speak. She stood rigid, held in place by the reality settling over the room. Her influence, her pressure, her quiet coercion, none of it could shield her now. My grandson stepped closer to me, not hiding behind me, just standing beside me. The counselor stood on his other side, steady and solid. The truth was no longer a whisper or a suspicion. It was visible, documented, undeniable. And for the first time since all of this began, the ground beneath us felt steady. The rest of that day moved with the slow, heavy steps of a process finally beginning to correct itself. Within an hour of the confrontation, 2 officers arrived on campus at the district's request. They spoke with me briefly, then asked to interview the principal in a separate office. I didn't see the full exchange, just the way she stiffened as they escorted her down the hall, her authority stripped away as easily as a badge removed from a uniform. There was no shouting, no scene, only the quiet formality of people handling misconduct the way the system was designed to handle it. The district superintendent arrived later that afternoon, summoned by the counselor's report and the evidence I had provided. She reviewed the documents in silence, her expression hardening with each page. After a short meeting behind a closed door, she stepped out and announced that the principal was being placed on immediate suspension, pending a full investigation. Her tone was professional, almost detached, but the weight of her decision was clear. The pattern of coercion could no longer hide behind administrative jargon. By the next morning, Child Services contacted me directly. They acknowledged receiving the principal's complaint, but said they had reviewed the new information submitted by the district. Their voice on the phone carried a tone I hadn't heard in weeks. Certainty. The case is officially closed, the representative said. Unfounded. No further action will be taken. I thanked her quietly, not with relief, but with something deeper. A steady return of ground beneath my feet. No one would be showing up at my door with questions shaped like accusations. No one would try to pull my grandson away under false pretenses. A day later, teachers began submitting written statements to the district office. The counselor forwarded copies to me. Notes explaining altered records, undocumented removals from class, pressure put on staff to support the principal's concerns. None of them were dramatic. They were factual, brief, and professional. But together, they formed a clear picture. It felt strange seeing so many lines of text confirming what I had been piecing together in shadows. There was no satisfaction, just a quiet recognition that the truth had been visible to more people than I realized. At home, my grandson stayed close for the first time in months. One evening, while I was washing dishes, he walked up behind me and stopped like he wasn't sure how to begin. "I'm sorry," he said, voice barely above a murmur. I shouldn't have said those things. I was scared. He didn't cry. He didn't try to explain it all at once. He just stood there with that simple admission, honest and small. I set the dish down and rested a hand on his shoulder. "You're safe," I said. It was enough. He nodded and stayed beside me until the water cooled in the sink. The attorney helped me update my guardianship paperwork the following week. It wasn't dramatic, just signatures and notarized forms, ensuring no one could question my legal standing again without real cause. He explained each step methodically, giving me the structure needed to protect us from future interference. When the documents were finalized, he folded them neatly and handed them to me in a plain envelope. No congratulations, no speeches, just the quiet efficiency of someone who knew what was required. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still in a way that didn't carry dread. Not peaceful yet, but steady. The shadows that had gathered in corners seemed to thin out. When I sat down that evening, I realized my shoulders had lowered for the first time since this began. I exhaled long and slow, letting the tension drain from a place I hadn't known was holding it. There was no triumph in that breath, just a sober relief. The kind that comes after surviving something you weren't sure you could name until it stood in front of you. The danger had passed, but the weight of what almost happened stayed with me, grounding me in a way I wouldn't forget. In the weeks that followed, the house settled into a quieter rhythm, not the hollow quiet of fear, but the steady kind that shows up when a storm has finally moved on. I found myself thinking often about the moment I heard my grandson speak that cruel line. At the time, it felt like a cut made on purpose. Now I understood it differently. Children don't choose their words the way adults do. They echo the pressure around them, repeating the weight they don't know how to carry. His voice that day hadn't been hardened by anger. It had been shaped by someone else's influence, someone who twisted his fear into something sharp. Understanding that didn't erase the sting, but it changed its meaning. It reminded me how easily a child's trust can be redirected by an adult who knows how to press the right buttons. The principal had built her power on that. The quiet manipulation, the authority that made her words feel final, the way she convinced him that speaking against her would make everything worse. I didn't blame him anymore. He'd been caught in the middle of two worlds, one safe and one pretending to be. There is a particular heaviness that settles on a man my age when he sees how easily the young can be steered by fear. I spent many long nights replaying the steps that led us here, not to dwell on what went wrong, but to understand the path clearly enough that I wouldn't miss warning signs again. Age doesn't weaken instincts, it sharpens them. The mistake isn't growing older, it's ignoring the quiet alarm in your chest when something doesn't feel right. I learned the importance of documenting everything, not because I wanted to build a case, but because truth gets buried fast when powerful people decide to write their own version of it. Dates, emails, reports, phone calls, small pieces that, when put together, protected my grandson when his voice alone wasn't enough. If there's anything I'd tell another elder raising a child, it's this: trust your instincts and write things down. Facts speak clearly when fear tries to cloud judgment. I also learned that boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about drawing a line strong enough that no one can cross it without being seen. I didn't choose bitterness. I chose distance from anything that threatened our stability. Even after the district removed the principal, I kept my circle small, my focus tight. My grandson didn't need a rescuer. He needed someone who could stand steady when the ground underneath him shifted. One morning, a few days after everything settled, I offered to walk him to school. He hesitated at first, maybe unsure if the old routine still belonged to us. Then he nodded. We stepped out into the cool air, and for the first time in months, he walked beside me at an easy pace, not rushing ahead or hanging back. The school looked different now, not safer because the principal was gone, but because we were walking toward it on our own terms. He didn't say much during the walk. He didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't strained anymore. It was comfortable, familiar. When we reached the gate, he looked up and gave me a small nod before heading inside. It wasn't an apology or a promise. It was an acknowledgement, simple and honest. I stood there for a moment, letting the morning settle around me. The street felt calm. My hands felt steady. There was no fear pressing at the edges of my thoughts, just a quiet truth I carried with me as I turned to head home. Growing old isn't the danger. Staying silent when someone targets your family is.